Gaming as an industry and pastime is one of the largest in the world. For several years now, gaming has been larger than both music and film combined, and is a hobby enjoyed by billions the world over. In spite of the huge popularity of gaming, video games and their publishers have been a source of major controversy as of late. From the countless workplace abuses of large studios, to the mediocre cash grabs they call games, the AAA mainstream of gaming is increasingly viewed with caution, distrust, and distaste. As the titans of gaming grow ever more lazy and unpopular, an increased interest and respect for indie games has been developing. Indie games need no introduction. It's an umbrella term covering the huge number of smaller games from smaller studios. In spite of being made with less money and less manpower than mainstream devs, indies have become massively popular thanks to the sheer variety and quality of titles in the indie scene. The appeal and popularity of indies have taken gaming by storm, and they're increasingly becoming a staple for gamers and the gaming industry. Today, I want to look at the growth of indie games, see why they're so successful, and figure out what this golden age of indies says for gaming. Like and subscribe. The story of indie games is in many ways the story of the games industry, and indies trace their origin to the very beginning. The earliest video games, both for arcades and home consoles, were produced in-house by the manufacturers themselves. Groups like Nintendo, Namco, and Atari produced the hardware and software for their games, and third parties weren't really a thing. While arcades dominated the gaming scene during the 70s, you began to see a rise in home consoles near the end of the decade. The Atari 2600, released in 1977, would quickly become the go-to home console, and Atari would experience runaway success into the 80s. The success wasn't felt by the actual developers though, who received only modest salaries while Atari raked in millions. Frustrated by the lack of recognition and poor compensation, some of the top devs at Atari split off from the company and formed their own studio, Activision. In spite of its now sordid reputation, Activision can honestly be considered the first indie studio, and they actually helped blaze the trail for third-party publishing. The developers at Activision had experience working on the 2600, and naturally planned to develop games for that console. Atari, believing them to be illegitimate and in violation of NDA, planned to sue Activision for making games on their console. Fortunately, this lawsuit would eventually be settled. Activision could publish their games on the 2600, and Atari would receive royalties from their sale. This decision would form the basis of third-party publishing going forward, and open the door for additional third parties and indie studios. Back to Activision, the studio was wildly successful under this model, with their 1982 title Pitfall selling well over 4 million copies. Their success unfortunately spawned a legion of copycats, all trying to churn out cheap, poorly made games for the 2600. The resultant glut of low-quality games would lead to the 1983 video game crash, hampering if not killing countless studios and manufacturers. Just as indies had come into being, they were quickly snuffed out, and in many ways had themselves to blame. The American gaming industry would begin to rebound in 1985 with the release of Nintendo's NES. The NES had numerous advantages over the Atari 2600, with perhaps the most important being its quality controls. You see, the Atari 2600 would run any game you put in it. You didn't have to go through Atari for approval, just print out some carts and put them on the market, whether or not they were actually good. Nintendo had no intention of repeating this mistake, and installed software and hardware to counteract unlicensed cartridges. The 10NES system was a component of all NES consoles and cartridges, and would lock out unlicensed games from being played on the NES. The system required games to go through Nintendo, and unless they got the Nintendo seal of approval, they couldn't be played. This led to a wide selection of quality games for the NES, and in turn, restored consumer confidence in the games industry. While this was a great development for gamers and the larger industry, smaller developers were somewhat disadvantaged. Getting licensed through Nintendo was a much higher barrier to entry than just publishing on the Atari 2600. While small and indie devs were still a thing, large first and third-party studios were the norm, and it would remain this way for close to 2 decades. Indie games would begin to come into their own in the 2000s, thanks in very large part to the internet. Internet access exploded in the early 2000s, providing easy access to developer tools, along with a medium for the distribution of games. Adobe Flash, rest in peace big guy, was a simple but fantastic platform for indie game development, and you began to see a number of small but well-made Flash games crop up. Sites which hosted Flash games, like Newgrounds and Addicting Games, became wildly popular as well, and really helped promote this burgeoning gaming scene. Large publishers took notice of the growing interest in indies, and began setting up online storefronts that actually sold indie games. The biggest and most illustrious is of course Steam, but you had storefronts pop up on the Xbox and PlayStation as well. Not all of these early indie games were, good, but you had a number of breakout titles like Super Meat Boy, Amnesia, and Castle Crashers. It was games like these that really set the tenor for indies, and gave some serious legitimacy to the indie scene as a whole. Just as the internet provided a platform for indie games, it also provided a means of their promotion. Indie titles didn't really advertise in the traditional sense. They might be promoted on specific storefronts, but you weren't seeing ads on TV or on billboards for indies. Where they saw their greatest promotion was on the ever-increasing number of social media sites, mainly YouTube. Game reviews, Let's Plays, and all manner of gaming content was wildly popular on YouTube at the time. The virality of this content extended to the games being played. When big gaming channels looked at indies, you could expect interest in them to skyrocket. Thanks to their ease of access, coupled with the viral marketing surrounding them, by the 2010s, indies were a well-known and well-respected aspect of the games industry. Unfortunately, after the honeymoon phase was over, the gaming community began to notice some major issues surrounding indie games. Perhaps the least popular and most damning component of indie game development was the extensive use of crowdfunding platforms. A vision costs nothing, but it can be sold for quite a bit, and around the mid-2010s you saw a deluge of crowdfunding projects for indie games. While crowdfunding has led to a number of high-quality titles that delivered on their promises, you had just as many half-baked releases, cancellations, or straight-up rug pulls. Another issue seen with indies has been early access. Early access involves paying for an early, unfinished version of a game in the hope your early contributions will help it be finished. The issues here are in line with early access, in that the final product may not live up to the hype, deviate from the original vision, or never be delivered in the first place. Finally, indie games had developed something of a reputation for copycats. You had a number of indies that wanted to just mimic Minecraft or 7 Days to Die, rather than actually innovate in the space. Fortunately, the aforementioned issues would culminate in a correction in the industry. Moving into the late 2010s, indie gamers were a bit more discerning with the projects they supported. As a result, indie games needed to really innovate and stand out if they wanted to succeed, and this has led to a general increase in polish and overall quality in the indie scene. And that brings us to indies of today. Against the backdrop of an increasingly stale and unimpressive AAA industry, indie games are unquestionably in their prime. Over the past few years, the indie scene has churned out some of the most popular and critically acclaimed games in recent memory. This is all being done with small teams and microscopic budgets compared to the gaming titans of old, making these mini achievements all the more impressive. The reason for this runaway success has as much to do with the indies themselves as it does with the broader games industry. Corporate studios are all too eager to shove in microtransactions or predatory game mechanics to wring every last cent out of their fans. In addition, because of the ballooning costs for AAA game development, along with the risk-averse nature of the industry, we've had some of the most cookie-cutter titles in recent years. Finally, even if some giant studio stumbles into a breakout hit, it's both an uncommon sight and a matter of time before it's milked like the rest of them. Whereas corporate games treat the medium as a business, indies still treat it as an art. You see this in the most literal sense of the word. There have been a number of recent indies whose style and art direction are second to none. Just look at the 1930s animation of Cuphead, the psychedelic claymation of Hylics, and the Mobius-inspired aesthetics of Sable. Outside of their literal artistic merits, the indie scene has a greater variety of genres compared to AAA. While indies do contain your shooters, RPGs, and adventure games, you also see a wide variety of less service genres, like platformers, strategy games, and city builders. For certain genres, they achieved widespread popularity specifically because of indies. Take for example The Binding of Isaac popularizing roguelikes, and Factorio popularizing factory simulators. Indie games are also adept at modernizing older titles. You see this in indies that take very clear inspiration from titles of old, like Tinykin from Pikmin, Stardew Valley from Harvest Moon, and Bug Fables from early Paper Mario. They're well-crafted homages to beloved games, which often iterate or improve upon the original formula. In a similar vein, you have the growth of boomer shooters, lo-fi horror, and other games in a retro style. There is a clear nostalgia for the gameplay and aesthetics of yestercentury, and indies have led the charge in catering to it. Another factor in the growth and popularity of indies has been the increasing ease of game development. Making a game from scratch is no small task, but game development tools are becoming easier to use, better understood, and more robust with every day. On the low end, this has increased the number of people working on indies by sheer ease of access, and on the high end, it's made producing modern, high-quality games easier for indie studios. Finally, Perhaps the biggest reason indies have become so popular, and the biggest advantage they have over their AAA competitors, is the simple fact they're independent. Indies aren't reliant on shareholder approval or the whims of some deranged CEO. They don't have to release a half-baked product for the holiday market, or engage in grueling, unproductive crunch to get there. While indie studios do make games in the hopes of turning a profit, vision and actual passion can be realistically pursued in the broader indie scene. Because of this, along with the myriad factors listed before, indie studios have produced some of the most well-designed, poignant, and impressive games ever made. In short, indies really carry the soul of the industry, prioritizing the actual art form of gaming and its fans. Now, for all the good in the indie scene, the rave reviews and numerous awards, indies remain a relatively small portion of the overall games industry. Numbers vary, but the total percentage of gamers who actually play indie games is a little under 20%. The remaining 80% or so are strictly AAA, and are either uninterested in or unaware of the indie scene. This has given the corporate, institutional side of gaming a significant advantage. They're making substantially more money, and can thus heavily out-advertise anything indie. It's not that they're trying to suppress indie studios, if anything they want to purchase them, it's just that indies can't really compete on that front. The result has been the continued dominance of AAA in terms of sales, revenues, and player numbers, despite the ever-decreasing quality of AAA titles. This lack of quality is their biggest weakness, however, as many gamers are growing increasingly disinterested in AAA gaming. Corporate games companies only have themselves to blame, of course, what with their never-ending scandals, creative bankruptcy, and predatory business practices. AAA publishers will likely remain a major force in gaming, sure, but their inadequacies will undoubtedly turn more people towards indies, if not spur them to make their own games outright. To that end, indies have seen year-over-year growth both in the number of players and games produced. It's an exciting time, and there are countless quality indies currently in production and sure to wow. Hopefully in time, larger studios will learn from indies, return to their roots, and actually focus on quality. And even if not, indies will surely remain a vibrant and enjoyable part of gaming moving forward. Hey, thanks for reaching the end, and I hope you enjoyed this vid. After airing out my grievances with modern games in a recent video, I thought it worthwhile to go over some of the positives I saw in the industry. Definitely check that vid out if you haven't, and also thank you to all who supported it. It's been one of my highest performing videos, and it really makes me happy that so many people watched and enjoyed it. Also feel free to check me out on Twitch, I try to stream there on Thursdays, Discord where you can get updates or ask me questions, and Patreon where you can give me your hard-earned money. With that out of the way, headbutt the like, give the subscribe button a sloppy kiss, and that bell. Until next time, take care.